So, hello everybody. I'm John Mulligan. As I mentioned, I live here in the United States. I live in the state of Florida, in Tampa. So it's very hot and humid. I live pretty close to the beach, which is pretty much my vibe. I've been doing Agile since 2005 when I got my Certified Scrum Master certification while working at an American banking company called Capital One. And I've done a variety of roles. I've been a Scrum Master, a product owner. I've been a Agile coach. I've been a release train engineer. And for the last 5 years, I've been a consultant working with a variety of companies throughout the world. And I say throughout the world because literally last week I was in Mexico City helping out somebody. So been all over the place doing things. So for the agenda today, yeah, as we've already mentioned, you see the topics here. It is only an hour webinar and, probably going to zoom through this. So leave a little bit of room at the end for some questions. So I hope you guys can get some information out of here. All of the material that I've included in the slides here comes straight from Scaled Agile itself. So you'll see copyright notices on a lot of the pages here because I pulled it straight from the SAFe website. But let's go ahead and get going. If you would advance to the next slide, please. So this is what's called the SAFe Big Picture. And when you go to scaledagileFramework.com, you'll see the hyperlink at the bottom. This is a completely interactive website that gives you almost everything that you would need to know about Scaled Agile just by clicking on any of the words that are on the page, words or pictures on the page. So it is basically the reference for all the things that we do. But what I want to point out here is that bottom section where you see the word Agile Teams over on the left. The foundation for Scaled Agile is the Agile team. And we follow primarily Scrum, although you'll notice there it says Safe Scrum, and below that it says Safe Kanban. We use both Scrum and Kanban in our approach. Typically, Scrum is more appropriate when we are working with teams who are delivering brand new features and can plan out their work over a 2-week time period that we call an iteration. And Kanban is more appropriate for teams that are in more of a first in, first out, or a flow-based approach. That typically within an Agile release train would be your system team. Could also be your operations, HR, marketing, that type of thing, anybody else that might be joining your team. We operate off of what's called the team backlog that contains all the list of potential work. It doesn't really become real work until we go through the iteration planning process. And then as we kind of proceed forward, we go through typically 5 iterations per cycle. And a cycle is called a PI, or a planning interval. It begins with a 2-day PI planning session, and then we follow a process called the continuous delivery pipeline to deliver work throughout that entire 10-week cycle. We end with an iteration called the innovation and planning iteration, which is where, as the name implies, we do a little bit of innovation, training, preparation work, and we get ready and we do PI planning again, and the cycle repeats. One level up for that is the Agile release train. And that's really headed by product management and the architects working in collaboration to create the ART backlog. That backlog contains our features, and the features then flow through and are broken down into the stories that the teams then deliver. That's all sort of supervised and overseen by the release train engineer, who oversees and basically is the super scrum master for the Agile release train. So that's a little background. I'm not going to cover the rest of that there because we're going to go into a little more detail as we go along. But if you go on to the next slide. So these are what are called the 10 SAFe principles. Take an economic view. And so I'm just going to go through these kind of real quickly here. But take an economic view is basically looking at things from the perspective of we're here actually to generate value for our customers. So we're looking at it from an economics perspective. Now, if you're working in a government organization, your definition of economics is going to be different than a privately held company or a publicly held company that's obviously out to make a profit. But looking at it really from that perspective. Apply systems thinking is really talking about looking at things from the end-to-end process and deciding in that process, what are all of the interconnectivities that are going to go happen in there, looking for opportunities for value to flow through that system, and then trying not to optimize an individual component that ends up sub-optimizing the whole. For example, if you have a group of people who have an intake process, and you have to fill out some form and it goes into an intake process and then they work through the process, first in, first out kind of thing. Well, everybody else in the organization is waiting on them. They've actually optimized their system, but they have sub-optimized the whole. And so that is not an example of applying systems thinking. So we want to look at things from end to end. The third one is assume variability, preserve options. And in this option, what we're doing is we're following a philosophy of what we call set-based design. where we look at multiple different choices. Initially, we think, for example, what problem do we want to solve? Let's look at a myriad of problems. Let's narrow it down to one problem. Once we figured out that one problem, let's look at a large variety of potential solutions. And over time, we're going to narrow that back down to a single solution. So as we go down what we call the cone of uncertainty, our goal is to continue to remove the less viable options until we ultimately find the correct one at the end. Under build incrementally with fast integrated learning cycles, we're really looking at creating 2-week iterations, which the teams deliver work, as well as the 10-week PI cycle. And we're, of course, learning at the end of each one of those cycles through a retrospective or an inspect and adapt process. The next one, base milestones on the objective evaluation of working systems, is telling us that we're not going to base our milestones on a waterfall type approach, where we have something such as a requirements document or a design document. And the completion of either of those documents is a major milestone, but nothing has actually been delivered of value at that point. So what we're doing is we're saying our milestones are based on value creation. At the end of that first iteration, we have completed user stories. Those user stories have value, and we can show that we're achieving our milestones based on creating value. The next one, make value flow without interruptions, is all focused on removing impediments and handoffs and any other types of waste that's going to stop the value from flowing very quickly. The next one, apply cadence and synchronize with cross-domain planning, is all focused on the PI planning process. So we are on both a cadence and a synchronization concept. So if you have, let's say, anywhere from 5 to 12 agile teams working in parallel on an agile release train, they are all in a 2-week cadence. So they're all doing that, but we're synchronized in that we all start and stop our iterations and do PI planning all in the same days. The next one, which is unlock the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers. Knowledge workers, in a great book by Dan Pink called, I forgot what it's called. Anyway, he focuses on 3 things, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And those are the 3 things that really motivate knowledge workers. So autonomy is basically the ability to work somewhat on your own. Mastery is this being able to get very good at what you do. And then purpose is really about knowing that what you're doing provides value to yourself and the organization. Which leads to the next one, which is decentralized decision making. What we want to do is we want to push the decisions down to where the knowledge is. Typically, your knowledge workers have the most amount of the knowledge. Therefore, we're going to trust them because we've unlocked the motivation of knowledge workers. So they have that autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So we're going to allow them to make those decisions without having to run everything kind of up the flagpole. And then finally, organize around value, which is us creating both operational and development value streams, which I will touch on a little while later. Okay, next. All right, when we implement an agile release train, we typically go through this process. And you'll see on the next slide, this is actually based on John Kotter's work, the 8-step change process. But essentially, we start with creating, deciding to go safe. And a phrase we used to use a while ago, we called it the burning platform, which is something is typically, thank you, Drive. I see that in the chat. Yes, that's exactly what the book was. So we decide to go safe for one particular reason, and we start by beginning to do some training. We want everybody to be properly trained and to fully understand the process that we're going to do. So we usually start with some sort of a leadership training, which is what the Leading Safe class does. And then you want to make sure that on your release train, you have someone who's certified, which is the SPC certification, and the Implementing Safe training does that. But as you advance forward, you want to understand what those value streams are. So you'll see that we're going to do a value stream and art identification workshop. And once we identify what our operational value streams are, that'll allow us to begin to form our development value streams, which are also known as the Agile release trains. This process could take a couple months, and as we prepare for the first PI launch, so we get into that preparation mode where we're doing some more training of Scrum Masters and product owners. Eventually, we will train the entire Agile release train. And we'll, at this point, have built up our backlog of features, and those features will have been broken into some stories to some degree, and we're ready for that first PI launch. And then once we do that first PI planning session, it's kind of off the races. Every 10 weeks, we're going to repeat. So that's kind of the quick summary of that. I'm not going to go into detail on some of the later items, but essentially that's how we would begin to do it. Now, the question would be, when is it appropriate to use something like SAFe versus just Scrum? SAFe is best used if you have a larger organization of generally 5 to 12 teams of between 50 and 125 people who are able to work off of a common backlog. So if you have 10 teams, but they're all doing 10 completely different things, then scaled agile is probably not the right choice. But if you need 10 groups working in parallel to achieve a single goal and a single backlog of features, then scaled agile makes a lot more sense. Okay, next. All right, this is just the 8-step process for lean change by John Kotter. And you can see there that starts with that create the sense of urgency, build a guiding coalition. We're going to do that through things like creating a lean, agile center of excellence. We're going to start to form that strategic vision. We're going to create that art identification backlog and value stream identification. We're going to start to get that first group of people who really want to join. That's your initial volunteer army. Then you're going to start to remove barriers. And by removing barriers, lots of times you'll see in a transition between more of a waterfall approach to an agile approach, you'll find that we have a lot of institutional barriers that need to be changed. They're just processes and procedures that have come up over the years that are very waterfall centric, but honestly don't flex, and they're not really good enough for a very quick and agile approach. So oftentimes we need to really look at those and get rid of those processes or make modifications. Then the generate short-term wins. We've got that agile release train launched. We're going to do that first iteration. We're going to see value created in that first iteration, and that begins to show our short-term wins. And over time, we'll complete that first PI, and then it will build from there. That's where the sustained acceleration comes from. And then eventually, it potentially spreads to the rest of the organization and becomes more of a habit than it was. As we know, habits take a time to be formed, and so it takes a little while to sort of get past that old mindset and into the new mindset. So, yeah, go ahead. All right, so there are specific roles that are unique to an agile release train. The release train engineer is the primary one. As I mentioned, it's sort of the super scrum master or coach for the agile release train. That person is the one who is responsible for leading the PI planning sessions, as well as the coaches' syncs, and potentially removing all the impediments for the agile release train over time. It's obviously a much more difficult job than a standard scrum master job, because scrum masters have a responsibility of removing impediments for their teams, but those impediments they can't remove often get escalated up to the release train engineer. So you really only get the hard problems. And then product management, they're there to prioritize the art backlog. That art backlog is the list of all of our potential features that are going to go into the upcoming PI. Features, by definition, are constrained. They have to fit within a single agile release train, and they have to fit within a single PI cycle, which is, as I said, usually 10 weeks or less. So they are somewhat time constrained. And product management is going to own those features. They're going to work very closely with the system architect. So as the new ideas come through the continuous delivery pipeline, those new ideas, we need to make sure that they're actually technically feasible. So that's why we must collaborate with the architect to make sure that we have the right infrastructure and guidance in place to make sure that not only the idea is sound, but our ability to build it, maintain it, and sustain it over time also sound. The system team is there to make sure that we're following our DevOps practices, but also to ensure that we have the right environments. So our development environments, our testing environments, our release management processes, build automation, test automation, all those types of things that we would do to really help value flow through the system quickly is typically all managed by the system team. As I mentioned, that system team is typically more of a Kanban team than a Scrum team. And then finally, business owners, they're the key stakeholders on the release train. Essentially, I like to say they're the ones that write the check. So they essentially control the purse and the money. They are key stakeholders in the Agile release train in that they participate in PI planning, as well as all of the other art events, such as the system demos. They're also, from a lean budget perspective, one of our lean budget guardrails, because of course they're there kind of overseeing, but because we have decentralized decision making, they're not actually giving day-to-day direction to the teams because the teams are self-organizing. So, okay, go ahead. So I mentioned these a little bit. Business owners, as I said, they guide the direction of release train. They're the lean budget guardrails. They essentially are overseeing the art. They will participate in PI planning, as I mentioned. Typically during a standard PI planning session, you will see the executives, the leadership who is in that room. They start out PI planning with actually the first person that kind of gets up and speaks is actually the business owners. They're setting that vision and direction for the Agile release train. We have a couple safe ideas called transparency and alignment. And the transparency and alignment is really done quite well with the business executives standing up in front of the entire release train and discussing about what they see as the vision for the art. And that allows everybody on the team to start out with a simple baseline of understanding so that we are all aligned at the beginning of every PI cycle. So I get in product management, they're going to own and prioritize that art backlog that contains all the features. You'll notice that on that little chart there, you see something called WSJF. WSJF is a prioritization technique that we use for features called weighted shortest job first. Not going to go into a lot of detail here. I mean, literally, we could spend 2 days together. I typically do teach 2-day classes. Here I got an hour. So we're going to zoom through a lot of these things and let you guys ask questions. But weighted shortest job first is a prioritization techniques that really looks at several elements. It looks at your business value, the time criticality, and then a risk reduction and opportunity enablement component. As you know, many people typically think of something solely from the, oh, it's going to increase my return on investment, or it's going to bring in this additional revenue. And they might not factor in things like, well, how time critical is this versus, or, is it going to enable future functionality? So something like building out new infrastructure, right now there's no business value to that, but in the future there will be. So therefore, it has a lot of opportunity enablement. Building out some anti-fraud practices could have a risk reduction component, but the actual business value is not particularly high because people just don't want to have fraud, right? But we need to make sure we do that. So there's lots of factors, and of course, the element of that. The reason we call it weighted shortest job first is we also factor in those three things together, as well as how long do we think it'll take to build it. So we want to do the thing that's the most important and can be done in the least amount of time. That's essentially how it gets a higher priority. Product owners, one more thing on that. So product owners on the teams, they work at the team level. So there's a product owner on every team. They are the customer representative for the team, and their job is to prioritize the backlog and essentially be there to represent their customer as the teams are building out their stories and building out their stories, and they're refining those stories, and they're beginning to build those stories. Then the product owner has to approve and accept all of the stories upon completion to ensure that all of the acceptance criteria has been met and the business intent has been met as well. Okay, now you can go forward. Next. Thank you. All right. So we have something called the continuous delivery pipeline. So unlike a waterfall project where, the project gets started, it flows all the way to the end, and then it's done. And the people come together, they build the project, they finish the project, they all go away. We don't do that in an agile release train. So if you think about this mantra, instead of bringing people to the work, which is what we would do in a project, we bring the work to the people. So we stand up an agile release train. As I mentioned, it's typically between 50 and 125 people, usually somewhere between 5 to 12 teams. And we build this agile release train, and then we put them in place. And then through that art backlog of features, we begin to feed these teams their work. So we're not standing up teams and shutting them down all the time. We're actually going to have these teams for a very long time. So that continuous exploration phase is where we're thinking about all of our new ideas. We're working with market research. We're looking at customer feedback. We're looking at the competition, and we're figuring out what are the new things that we want to do. What are the features that we want to build? And then, of course, working in conjunction with the architects, we're going to make sure that these features are viable and sustainable. That's going to create the art backlog, which we then bring into PI planning. Once we've done PI planning, we're kind of off the races at that point. The teams are going to start doing all of their work, and that's where continuous integration comes in. So they're going to develop all those stories. They're going to build them. They're going to deploy them to the trunk, and eventually we're going to release them. We're going to roll them into the staging environment where they're ready to go to production. The continuous deployment is where we're actually going to roll to production. Now, the difference within SAFe is that going to production and releasing are two separate events. Typically, historically, they've been the same thing. But with our DevOps environment and other features or ability to do this, we're able to actually roll to production with all our features hidden from the customer. And then we're able to choose when we actually want to do a release. That's why we call it release on demand. And that actually puts the decision to release back on the business and product management and the business. So we've done our job in IT, and we've rolled these things to production. We've now tested them in production to make sure that they're working properly. And then they'll sit there until they're ready to be released to the customer. So, all right. So here's the kind of difference between operational and development value streams. So operational value streams are really, if you look back at Taiichi Ohno, who was creator of the Toyota production system, really at one time mentioned that all we're doing is looking at the time where the customer makes the order until we collect the cash. And we're looking at all the steps that are in between that. And that's what an operational value stream is. It's when the initial idea is created, that's a trigger. It's going to go through a series of steps. Ultimately, we're going to deliver value to the customer. Now, how do we do that? Well, we do that with development value streams. So to give you an example here, let's say you're going to apply for a home loan. And so the customer decides they're going to go do some research on the internet about how to apply for a home loan. Then they find a house they want to buy. And so they apply for the loan. And then they go through the credit and the underwriting process. And eventually the loan is approved. They purchase the home and now they have to pay the money back. So now we have to worry about taxes and insurance and receiving payments and sending out statements and that kind of thing. And eventually, at the end of many, many years, the loan is paid off. So that would be an operational value stream. The development value streams, though, I can think of at least 3 development value streams that would be associated with that one operational value stream. You might have a development value stream that's entirely focused on just the internet portion of that, so the customer can do research. You might have another development value stream who's focused on the application process. So a customer goes through and applies, there's credit, there's underwriting, that type of thing, and loan approval. And then once the loan is approved, there might be a third one. They're supporting a call center and the customer service aspects of people calling in about their loans, about mortgage statements, about escrow payments, about loan payoffs, all that type of thing might be a third operational value stream. So, development value stream. So you can have multiple development value streams supporting a single operational value stream. And each development value stream is its own Agile release train. All right, so at the end of PI planning, what we're doing is we're going into PI planning with a series of features. And the features are the business request. So that's why I put in the slide here that Agile is a pull system, not a push system. So we're going in with essentially an ask. That ask is the list of, let's say, top 10 features. That's kind of our rule of thumb. It doesn't have to be 10, but top 10 features is a nice rule of thumb, easy to remember kind of a word. And so you're going in with that. And then the team is going to spend 2 days spending in the PI planning, and they're going to decide, well, how much of these features can we actually accomplish in the upcoming 10 weeks? And then once they figure that out, then they're going to write a series of PI objectives. And those PI objectives are essentially the way that they match demand with capacity. And then we go back to the business and say, hey, I heard what you asked for. Those are all your features. We've created a series of PI objectives. And now the business will come back and they will score those and they will give them a business value. And that's their way of saying, all right, we understand what you have capacity to accomplish. We're essentially going to prioritize those with a score. And that will give you some direction going forward because, of course, we have decentralized decision making, but this gives them that direction for how they should focus on. The AV column, by the way, is not done till the end of the PI. That's the actual value. So once we're done building it, we'll compare. It's one of the metrics we actually look at is if you said you're going to, if this was worth a 10, did you do everything you said you're going to do? Or are we going to give you 10? Or are we going to give you some sort of partial credit? Maybe 8 out of 10, that kind of thing. So PI objectives help us to match demand with capacity. Right. The next thing we're going to do coming out of PI planning is this thing called the ART planning board. Because we have multiple Agile teams working together, oftentimes there are dependencies. And the way that we map these dependencies and visualize them to make them easy to understand and to track is through this concept of an ART planning board. And this ART planning board is done where we have basically each column is an iteration throughout the PI, and each row is a team. It could be milestones and events. You'll see the slightly darker line near the bottom. You see UX help and architects. So that's slightly darker. They're not one of our feature teams, but they're still working with us on the art. You'll also notice that iteration 1.5, there is blank. That is the innovation and planning iteration. It is there solely as an overflow buffer. We should never intentionally plan work in that because if you plan work in there, it's no longer a buffer. So we only plan for the first 4 iterations. And if something rolls over at the end, then we have room to accommodate it before we start the next PI. And then what we do is we put a blue sticky in place when we intend to finish one of our features. If we have no dependencies on other teams, as you'll see with Lions in iteration 1, then there's no red string. If we do have a dependency on another team, then we'll go talk to that team and we'll determine what the dependency is, and they will put it on their board using a red sticky for when they intend to accomplish that dependency. And then we'll tie them together with a red string just so that we can see what goes with what. So that is the ART planning board. So our 2 outputs to PI planning are the PI objectives that you saw on the previous slide, as well as the ART planning board. So, and unfortunately, I can't see the questions or the comments, so I'm not sure if I'm missing stuff as I go through. And I apologize if you guys are saying, "Hey, how come John's not answering my questions?" And the answer is because I can't see them. So,
John, do you want me to tell the questions now, or can we take this
well, let
during
me
the
pause
end?
for a minute. Oh, actually, let me just pause for a second to see if there's anything that I need
There
to.
is,
Yeah. Oh, I can see the questions, but not while I'm
there
talking.
is. What does it mean? Let me tell you the
I
question.
got it.
What does it mean, release to product, but yet to be made available to the customer?
Got it. Okay, thank you. So that's the difference between production and release on demand. So when we move it to production, we use technologies such as feature toggles that allow us to move it into production in a way that it's invisible to the customer. And when we're ready to do a release, we actually toggle that feature on and make it available to the customer. Now, if we'll fully admit, I don't work in DevOps, so you pretty much hit the limit of my knowledge of exactly how that's done. I do know, I've seen it done. I personally have never flipped a switch, so I couldn't tell you that. But I do know that we use feature toggles, and it's something that you generally have to have that technology in order to do it. It is not entirely, inexpensive to set up the infrastructure for an agile release train because you need to have your development environments, your testing environments. You have to have two parallel production environments. One is toggled on and one is toggled off, as well as the ability to do releases. So it's not a trivial undertaking, and you will, if you're going to do this, need to make sure you've got some good DevOps skill sets on your team. So. All right, so the next thing I just want to talk about, I kind of alluded to this slide earlier when I was going over the SAFe big picture, but this is essentially the PI cycle. It starts with PI planning, and this was just, as I said, 2 days. The output is the PI objectives and the ART planning board. Then we go through a series of four, I would call them normal iterations. And at the end of every iteration, we will have, well, let's just talk about Scrum in general. In Scrum, even Safe Scrum, we do the same things that I call it normal Scrum would do. So you have iteration planning, you have a daily team sync, used to be known as the stand-up, they don't call it that anymore. So there's the daily team sync. We have backlog refinement where we're getting our stories ready for the upcoming iterations. And then we ended up with an iteration review and a retrospective. So those 5 events, very standard, facilitated by the Scrum Master. The other thing we've added on, though, with SAFe is that we do a system demo. And the system demo, while the iteration review is focused on essentially it's your team, maybe a few stakeholders, that kind of thing, the system demo is one of the ways that we communicate across the art. So we've done PI planning together. We were all in one big room for 2 days, and then we've gone off on our own for 2 weeks and we've done an iteration. At the end of that iteration, we come back together and we do a system demo. So as you saw on that slide with the ART planning board, you'll notice that there might be dependencies. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are showing our work to the other teams, and we're seeing their work. It allows us to have an opportunity to ask questions, as well as it gives our leadership team and our business owners a chance every 2 weeks to see the progress being made towards our PI objectives. The other thing I'm going to point out on this slide, you notice it says features, stories, and enablers. Let me explain what an enabler is. And the reason it's red, well, it's red because it's an enabler and you don't have to read the word. But the reason we have enablers are kind of our ways that they fall into 4 categories. There's architecture, infrastructure, compliance, and exploration enablers. Your architecture and infrastructure enablers are more focused on building out the infrastructure for future development. Compliance enablers would be focused on, let's say the government says, hey, we need you to do this thing, and we got to go figure out what to do, or maybe we just have to do a whole bunch of testing to ensure compliance, that kind of thing. That might fall into a compliance enabler. And the exploration enablers, sometimes if you hear them at the story level, you might hear the word spike. A spike is a form of an exploration enabler. And those are basically us getting the information that we need to do future work. So for example, if I was building out a weather app and I wanted to know the current temperature, and I wrote a story that said, as a dog owner, I want to know the current temperature so I know what to wear to walk my dog in the morning. And we say, great, that's an easy story, but we don't know where we're going to get the weather. So we would create an enabler and we would go figure out how do we get the weather? Like, what's the data we need to send? Who are we sending it to? What format does it need to be in? And then on the return round, what format are we receiving back? What data are we receiving? And once we learn all that information, then we're able to actually do the story to figure out the current temperature. So that would be one example of an enabler. But anyway, so we do this 4 cycles of standard iterations, and then we do the 5th one. The 5th one is an IP iteration. It stands for the innovation and planning iteration. And that iteration is where we have a chance to, it's an overflow buffer. It's an overflow buffer where we're going to go talk about, if anything flows over that we didn't quite finish, it gives us a little bit of buffer to finish it. It gives us a chance to up level our skills, to do innovation, maybe things like hackathons for a couple of days hackathon is where you basically work on whatever you want with whomever you want, as long as it is business focused and we do a little demo. And oftentimes that leads to additional features being created because, essentially the wisdom of the crowd concept. So at the end of the IP iteration, and then of course, PI planning occurs on usually the second week of the IP iteration, and then the cycle starts again. So, all right. So I mentioned this before. I like this slide because it's 2 inputs, 2 days of planning, and 2 outputs. So the inputs are basically the vision and the top 10 features. We spent 2 days of doing PI planning. And as I mentioned, the art outputs are the PI objectives and the art planning board. So 2 inputs, 2 days of planning, and 2 outputs. Now, the 2 days of planning, a little flexible. Typically, if you're in person, 2 days makes a lot of sense. This group, for example, I know we're spread out all over the world. Therefore, I would not do it in 2 days because of the time zone problems. I would probably stretch it out over 3 or 4 days if we were actually doing PI planning together, just because we want to respect people's time zones and ability to sleep. And I don't want you to work at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon here in the United States. So we would stretch it out a little bit more. All right, go on to the next one. All right, so I mentioned the innovation and planning iteration, and this is kind of the typical thing that we do. As I mentioned, we've got that buffer for overflow work, skills development, learning. Here's a chance to take some additional classes, up-level your skills. Perhaps you need to do a little more backlog refinement in preparation for the upcoming PI planning session, innovations, hackathons, things like that. Now, a good rule of thumb going into PI planning, well, just a good rule of thumb in general. As an Agile team, you should typically have somewhere between 2 and 2.5 iterations of stories that are, quote, ready, meaning that you've written them, you've refined them, you understand how you're going to build them and test them, and you've put points on them. And I know we haven't talked about points, and I saw somebody ask about points. So let me just quickly cover that. We use what's called the modified Fibonacci series. So Fibonacci, if you want to do the math at home, is essentially 2 numbers added, the 2 sequential numbers added together create the third. So 0 and 1 is 1, 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 1 is 3, 3 and 2 is 5, and then it goes 8, then it goes 13. But then we call it the modified Fibonacci because the next in the sequence would be 21, but we don't do that. So we do 20, 40, 100. And Mike Cohen, when he wrote his book, Agile Estimating and Planning, said basically those larger numbers would imply, if we use the real Fibonacci, they would imply precision where no precision actually exists. So we just use 20, 40, 100. Most teams will point estimate their stories of usually using 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8, sometimes 13. But if you use 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, that's essentially 5 story sizes in a 10-day iteration. That pretty much covers everything. The 1-pointers take a day or so. Your 8-pointers, maybe your 13, usually take almost a full 2 weeks. And 2, 3, 5 falls somewhere in between. It's honestly just about as precise as that. There's no hours to point assignment. That's not how this works. It is just a relative story sizing. It's like me saying, basically, is my little pad of stickies here smaller than, let me see, than my piece of paper? And the answer is yes. Therefore, the paper has more points than that. That's about as simple as it is. Okay. So the innovation and planning session, we want to make sure we have about 2 to 2.5 iterations of stories ready to go when we go into PI planning. But as you saw, a PI is 4 iterations long. So you're only going to go in with about 2 iterations ready to go. Otherwise, it's kind of over planning and it misses the point of PI planning. In PI planning, you'll basically flesh out those final iterations of stories, not at a very high level, not a lot of detail because you're going to continue to refine them later, but just enough detail that you can begin to identify dependencies with the other teams. So good rule of thumb, as a Scrum Master or as a product owner, your team should always have 2 to 2.5 iterations of stories ready to go. Now, if you're doing the math at home, you'll recognize that in order to have 2 iterations of stories ready going into PI planning, and each iteration is 2 weeks long, that's a month, you should have your features ready to go a month before PI planning. If you don't have them ready a month before PI planning, you're already behind. So you want to make sure as a product management team and architects that at least a month before PI planning, all of your features have been finalized and prioritized. They're ready for the teams to begin refinement So a month later, they're ready to go into PI planning and they're properly prepared. Okay. All right, then let's talk a little bit about measurement here. So we like to measure three different types of metrics. We have, hold on, back up. Competency, flow, and outcome metrics. So outcome, basically, we're looking and saying, we start a feature should have a benefit hypothesis, okay? And a benefit hypothesis essentially is telling us what good thing do we expect to occur as a result of building out this feature. And it should also have acceptance criteria, which tells us when this feature is complete, how do I know? Well, it meets all the acceptance criteria. And so every feature should have that. So our outcome metrics are looking to say, all right, we built this. Did it do what we said it was going to do? That's an outcome metric. Our flow metrics are all focused on how do things flow. It's things like our velocity. That's a perfect example. Our velocity, and there's a few others we'll talk about in a little bit, but our velocity metrics really key. And then the other one's competency. So how proficient are we? And there's ways to do this. There's a measure and grow assessment where we're looking at the 7 core competencies of business agility. The teams can self-assess that. We kind of track that over time to make sure that teams not getting better, or they are getting better and not getting worse at different things. So those are the 3 things. Be wary of things that we call vanity metrics. Vanity metrics are those that they look good on paper, but they don't actually tell you anything useful. So for example, if you said, we're completely tracking new customer enrollments, but you're not looking at customer attrition, then new customer enrollments is a vanity metric, because it should be something like net customer enrollments, because you want to know pluses and the minuses. So just be careful as you're setting up your metrics that you find metrics that are actually appropriate and are not vanity metrics that just look good but don't actually tell you anything. So, all right. So measuring outputs, one way to do it is what we call key performance indicators, and these are things you can set up in advance. So here's a couple examples. The pirate metrics. So they're called pirate metrics because what does a pirate say? They say "arr." Yeah, there you go. And so AARRR, pirate metrics: acquisition, activation, revenue retention, and referrals. Those are some software ones. You see some other examples on there as well. I won't read through all those, but I'm assuming that these slides will become available later. But just take a look at some KPIs. Those are key performance indicators, and those will help you measure outcomes. Next is OKRs. OKRs are objectives and key results. So here you see a good example, of their objective: achieve a dominant position within the autonomous delivery market. And then you see some key results. And then notice the key results have a metric associated with it. So for example, increase serviceable market to 75% within 18 months. So it has a target and a date associated with it, right? So that's good. Net promoter score from 35 to 60, that type of thing. So you put some things in there, and then you can track that over time and decide, all right, are we doing what we should be doing or not? Okay, so objective key results. That's going to form your what we call strategic themes. Your strategic themes help drive the direction of your organization. So we like to say if the business is not aligned with a strategic theme, you probably should not be doing it. So strategic themes are generally created more at the executive or the enterprise level, and they kind of get fanned out across the organization. So if your organization is relatively small and you don't know what your strategic themes are, start asking around, see if you have some. So, all right, and these are some of the flow metrics I mentioned right there. So distribution, I looked at some questions, and yes, I'll get to enablers here in a minute unless that question got answered. But distribution, so we have an idea that we call the capacity allocation model. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we are not focusing 100% of our effort on new features and neglecting things like maintenance and other types of things, and enablers, for example. So what we do is we create this thing. Just imagine a pie chart, a circular pie chart, and a certain percentage of that pie chart is focused on new feature development, a certain is on maintenance and refactoring, and a certain portion is on enablers. And we do that in conjunction between product management and architecture, usually at PI boundaries. The product owners understand that. And then what we're doing is we're looking at it over time, and we're thinking to ourselves, all right, are we doing a reasonably good job of ensuring that our work is adequately distributed? Velocity is just, you can track that multiple ways. A lot of times you'll see that done as story points completed per iteration. Teams are definitely going to track their velocity. Here's something I'll tell you is not really too interactive, but I'll just say, should velocity be used to compare teams with each other? The answer is no, for multiple reasons. One is velocity is based on the number of story points that a team can complete, and there's a couple of variables associated with that. One is every team is probably, well, they're unique in their composition of individuals. They're also somewhat unique in their way that they story point their stories. So those two variables alone would tell you that it's not appropriate to compare teams based solely on story points. Okay, so don't use velocity as a comparison. Velocity is there for one reason. It's there so that you can help figure out how much work I'm going to do in the future. So if I have an average velocity of 30 points, it's pretty good guess that upcoming I'm going to do around 32 points in my next iteration. So that's the whole purpose of velocity. It's not there to measure ourselves with anybody else. Flow time is just a metric, see how long does it take to flow our work through the system, looking for bottlenecks. Load is helping us to measure our work in process, which is we don't want too much work in process. The phrase that all of my students hear me say is stop starting and start finishing. So we don't want too many things in process at one time. And then flow efficiency, looking at the non-value added work efforts. Honestly, flow efficiency is a little bit difficult to track from a metrics perspective, but it's there. And then flow predictability, which essentially, when I showed you guys the PI objectives and I said that they were scored with the business value, and at the end of the PI, we score them again with actual value. Flow predictability is essentially the ratio of those numbers. Our target is somewhere between 80 and 100%. And what we're doing is trying to look to see how well are we doing in that respect. So, all right, next, I'm looking at the clock here. It's 10 minutes till, so I forgot how many slides I have left. So we'll just kind of go through these real quick so you can see what I just discussed. There's flow distribution. The blue is the stories, the red's the enablers, the yellow is the maintenance. And you see in this particular case, over an iteration by iteration basis, that ratio that changed. So they went through a time period there where they were spending a lot of time working on enablers. And then they got through the enabler portion, and that allowed them to spend a little bit more time on new feature development. Notice though that they also did not neglect maintenance. There's an element of maintenance involved in all of their iterations. So, all right, next. This is your velocity chart, very typical. Does it bounce around a lot like this? Yes, it does. Multiple reasons, you might have holidays, you might have vacations. We're using the Fibonacci series. There's a whole bunch of reasons that it's not going to be entirely, the same every single iteration, but this one looks pretty reasonable, plus or minus a few points here and there, seems pretty normal. But we're going to look at that over an iteration by iteration basis, and that'll help us predict how much work we can do going forward. All right, next one. Next one is you guys. It's not my slides. So
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much. So
there was a
before
question. Let me answer this one. There's a question about enablers. Srinivas, did I answer the enabler question? Can you just give me a yes or no in the Q&A section? If not, I'll happy to give you more answers there. And while you type that, go ahead and say what you're going to say, and we'll get back to questions in a minute. Go for it.
Yeah, we'll start with the Q&A really soon. Thank you so much, John, for giving us all the insights on what Kanban is, what planning PI is. Also, thank you for letting us know the 10 safe principles. Then we also wanted to know how to be a scaled agile like a pro. And then also thank you so much for giving us 8-step process for leading change, which were institute, create, build, form, sustain, generate, enable, and enlist. Thank you so much, John, for all this information. And also,
Welcome.
sorry.
I said you're welcome.
Okay, perfect. And also, it was a very good example which you gave us to make us understand the difference between operational value stream and development value stream. That was an excellent example, and I'm sure everyone would have understood with that example, and how to use KPIs to measure outcomes, how to use OKRs to form strategies, teams. Thank you so much, John, for giving your valuable time and valuable insights. So going ahead, we would be starting with the Q&A now. So we have a question. We don't have a question. So I would request everyone to drop in your questions so that John can help you with the answers.
And I just dropped my LinkedIn into the chat there. If anybody wants to connect with me offline, feel free to send me a note on LinkedIn. Happy to help.
Quickly, if there are any questions.
For 70 people, you guys are a quiet bunch. All right.
I don't see his LinkedIn.
Oh,
Okay.
let me see. Oh, because it only went to a few other people. Hold on. Thank you for that. You're right. It only went to the host and panelists. There you go. Thanks, Derek. Appreciate it.
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Derek. So meanwhile, you guys shoot out your questions. Here are the success stories on the screen. You see Pallavi Singh, who have done the SAFE course with us, which was POPM. And then you can see the certificate here from the Scale Agile framework she has received. The Aishwarya has received. So perfect. Uh, so we have a question, John, from an anonymous. Do you want me to read out the question for you?
Let me see. Hold on. Multiple teams work for program/product development, but their involvement may vary. In PI planning, how many teams with less involvement will make this team fully utilized? Okay, let me see if I understand that question. So first of all, within an Agile release train, ideally, everybody is fully dedicated to the train, especially within each of their individual Scrum teams. Now, you may have some of the other elements of the team. What we really want to do is we want to make sure that we're not going outside the Agile release train a lot in order to, because that just slows us down. So we want as many people in the release train. So the example I often use is compliance or security. So compliance, a person from compliance does not need to be on every single Agile team, but they probably should be on the Agile release train. So we have a single point of contact for questions. They're going to be involved in feature development, and they're going to be with the teams as they're writing their stories. We want to make sure that we use this concept, a built-in quality concept called shift learning left, but essentially getting all these things done as soon as possible. So at the end, we're actually not going to have a problem with somebody saying, "Oh, no, it's not going to work," right? I'm reading some other QA. I'll get to that next. All right, let me see here. I see a question that says, "I've done PSPO." I'm not sure what PSPO is. Should I do a SAFE course to become a SAFE product owner? Ideally, if you want the SAFE certification, yes, you should take the POPM class. If you want that, there are other classes. Of course, leading SAFE is a good class as well. But if you're focused on a product management career or product owner career, then so the POPM class is about 70% product owner, 30% product manager. There's another advanced course called APM, or Agile Product Management. That class is much more heavily focused on product management, which essentially is focused on creating new products. So there's a little bit more design thinking in there, software licensing models, software pricing models, different things like that. This is something you would be thinking of as a product manager that product owners at a team level are often not typically involved in.
We have a couple of questions in the chat as well, John.
Yeah, I'm switching over here. Let me see here. Okay, let me get back down. Okay, so how do I handle if the work didn't get completed in an art cycle? Okay, so there's a couple things to do. So I guess you're saying like it didn't finish at the end of the PI. There's a couple of things to consider if something doesn't finish at the end of the PI. You essentially, the most often thing is you would just roll it over. However, you have to remember that we prioritize our backlog using weighted shortest job first. So if something didn't finish, the question we have to ask is, what we did finish, is it good enough? Or do we want to spend additional effort, finishing up what didn't finish? And it's a cost benefit analysis, right? So is the new feature that's next in line more important than finishing up the old one? That's the question you really need to have to ask before you can decide what to do. But, and the third option basically is you go, it's good enough. I'm just going to stop and I'm not going to roll it over at all. So that's another option. I see a question about books. So my books, I just moved to Florida and my books are not impact. So, but the some I would recommend is the first book I ever read was the Scrum book by Ken Schwaber. I've also read the book by let's see, Lean Software Development, I believe is what it's called, with Mary and Tom Poppendiek, Agile Estimating and Planning with Mike Cohen. What else is good? Leading Agile Retrospectives. And there's a new version of that one out actually by Esther Derby and Diana Larson. So if you're a Scrum Master and you want to understand that, those are really good choices. And then Lisa Atkins has a really good book on Agile. And I can't remember what Lisa's, I'm going to look that one up. But Lisa Atkins has a really good book on coaching, Agile coaching. So those are the ones. And then if you really want to understand a lot of the stuff that SAFE does, there's a book by Mick Kirsten called Project to Product. And that one, when I read that book, I was amazed at how much overlap there was on that between that book and what I saw in Safe. So Project to Product by Mick Kirsten. That's a great one. So, um, as a refresher, how is Scrum going to help me get a job? It's a resume enhancer. I will say that my first so I took Leading Safe, which was my first Safe class somewhere in 2012, 13, somewhere in that frame, did about 10 years ago. And I had it on my LinkedIn. And one day I'm in the grocery store and I receive a phone call from a recruiter. And they essentially recruited me based on my LinkedIn profile to go from Capital One to Anthem, which is a health insurance company here in the US. And so it's basically, my certification posted on my LinkedIn got me a job. And honestly, I would not be working for Knowledge Hut right now doing some of their training if they hadn't found me on LinkedIn. So I say get trained and be active on LinkedIn because that's the key right there. That's how you get jobs. Almost every job I've done in the last 5 years has come from people reaching out to me on LinkedIn. Honestly, me applying for jobs on LinkedIn, I've had zero success. But people reaching out to me has been where I'm making all my money right now. So be active on LinkedIn. That's the thing. Um, I'm Safe Certified 4.0. I upgraded 5.1 last year. Okay, so Safe 6 is where we are now. 6.0 is where we are now. I would say the benefit of it is, well, if you're not upgraded, the longer you wait, it depends on what you want to do, right? If you want to kind of maintain your certification because the knowledge upgrades, all the time. Every time there's an upgrade from 4 to 5 to 6, there's going to be a slight change. For example, the 10 safe principles, one of them, number 6, changed with Safe 6.0, so they're slightly different. But as far as like career wise, um, unless someone's specifically asking for your certification. I know that for me, for example, people are like, are you Safe 6 certified, 6.0 certified? And I'm like, yes, I am. So it is a question I get asked. So for me, it's absolutely critical that I have the upgraded certification. Plus, the more it goes along, and honestly, if you finally want to certify, it just gets harder, right? Your knowledge gets more and more out of date. That's it. So how to use Agile in situations like conflict management? Ooh, that's a great question. Conflict management. Um, we talk about conflict management a little bit in the Scrum Master course because a Scrum Master is not really a conflict manager per se, but honestly, the best book that I would have ever read that's totally not is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. That by far is probably the best leadership book. I read it in high school when I was in my high school marching band because I was going to be the drum major of my band. And that was my first real leadership role is in high school when I was 16 or 17 years old. I became a naval officer after that, and I've been in leadership roles for the rest of my life. But that's the one book that I would read that really was very helpful when it comes to, and it's like I said, totally not even related to Agile, but I would say that read that book. It's not very thick, and it's been around for almost 100 years, and it still totally applies. So, um, the difference between Safe 5 and 6, I'm not sure I have time to answer that. And yes, I can start typing in a minute. I can't type and talk, so if you hang out, I'll type some of those books in the chat here in a little bit. 5 and 6, there were some changes to the flow. So the flow things like flow velocity, all that kind of stuff. There's flow-based changes. There's changes to the safe principles. I upgraded a year and a half ago. So those are the first two that like pop in my head. 6.0 is now so familiar to me that I kind of forgot what was in 5, the differences, to be totally honest. Coaching Teams by Lisa Adkins. Yes, that is the one I recommended. Absolutely. Lisa and I were friends at Capital One, so I know her personally. Let's see what else.
I guess those are the questions.
Oh, and then the question on how you upgrade to different versions. Okay, so you need to have a Safe Studio login. And once you get into Safe Studio, now if you don't have a Safe Studio login because it expired, a couple ways to get that. Every time you get a new Safe certification, it extends you, or you just pay the annual fee for whatever certification you have, and that gets you the license. And then there's usually a button in there that you just search for it, but there's a button in there that says upgrade, and you just go through. So to go from 5 to 6, there was a series of videos to watch and then a quiz. It only had like 20 questions on it. You had to have a 100% pass rate. But you could, if you missed it, you could take it again. So, and I will admit, I missed one question. I was a little annoyed. So I went back and I took it the second time. I got that question right. Screwed up one I'd previously gotten right, so I missed one question again. So on the third try, I got them all right. Anyway, but yeah, that was me. 19 out of 20, different 19 out of 20, 20 out of 20. But yeah, it's usually that. Now, other versions of Safe, oftentimes it's as simple as you watch a video and it marks the completion of the video, and then you get the upgrade. So it just depends on how much it upgrades at one time.
I guess
All right.
we are done with the Q&A. Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much for all your valuable time and answering all the questions. So taking forward, thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us till the last.